These are the frequently asked questions for 7-3 Day 2 for pre-calculus. Number 60, kind of an interesting problem because it said, we could solve this however we wish to solve it. So, my guess is that many people grabbed the calculator, punched this in, and were saddened to see what the results were, that you couldn't get things exactly as you needed to get them. So I'm going to go ahead and warm up my calculator for the smartboard here, and I'll show you what happens. So we go ahead and put this matrix into the calculator, and we do reduced row echelon form, and that's what we get. And that makes us none too happy. We're hoping to see the answers for X, Y, and Z, but we should have realized that the matrix isn't going to be the correct size to give us exactly what we want. So we did our REF, and I'm just going to go ahead and put things in fraction form instead of decimals here. We get 1, 0, negative 0.2 is negative 1/5, and then we have negative 1, 0, 1, and negative 0.6 is negative 6/10, which is negative 3/5. And then we have a nice little negative 2. So you start thinking, okay, well, what really happened here? Well, in order to see that, what we want to do is take a look and say, all right, obviously there's something we don't have here, and that's going to be Z. So the best that we're going to be able to do, because this is X and this is Y, but we don't have any way to find Z, is to say, we don't know what Z is. It's going to be the third coordinate in our ordered triple. And then what we can do is take what we do know from our reduced row echelon form, which is X minus 1/5 Z equals negative 1, and we can solve that for Z. So at least we can put things, we can solve that for X, so at least we can put things in terms of Z into our ordered triple, so that once we get Z, we'll have a formula that's all ready for it. So with this one, we would add 1/5 Z to both sides, and we would have X equals 1/5 Z minus 1. So now, once we know what Z is, we can not only find that third coordinate, but we can also figure out what the first one is. And then we're going to do the same thing with our Y down here. So that will give me Y minus 3/5 Z equals negative 2. Again, I want to get things in terms of Z, so I'm going to go ahead and add 3/5 Z to both sides. So Y will equal 3/5 Z minus 2. All right, and that will go right here. So 3/5 Z minus 2. All right, that has to be it. We don't have any way of figuring out what Z is, but we do know how X and Y relate to Z. So if we get some more information, then we could continue on with this. Until then, that's the best we can do. And pretty obviously, we didn't run into anything like this in the examples from the book, so kind of a little challenge problem going on there with number 60. Number 75, we have investments. And we have Monica receives an $80,000 inheritance. She invests part of it in CDs, certificates of deposit, earning 6.7% APY, annual percentage yield. Parts in bonds, 9.3% APY, and the remainder in a growth fund that earns 15.6% APY. She invests 3 times as much in the growth fund as in the other two combined. How much does she have in each investment if she receives $10,843 in interest the first year? So 2 things I'm looking at right away, and that is we've got a total there of all of her investments. So if we say that CDs are X and bonds are Y, and the growth fund is Z, we know that X plus Y plus Z has to equal 80,000. So there's the first equation. It's all about what she invested. We also know that this is about interest. So there's another total that has to do with interest. So now I need to go back and figure out, well, what is she going to get for interest on each of these? And they told us 6.7% for the CDs, but we have to put that into a decimal form, so that'll be 0.067x, because we take those percentages and divide those by 100. And then plus, and then we go after the bonds. Well, the bonds were 9.3, so 0.093, and I'm going to run out of space here. Y plus the growth fund, 0.156 Z, has to equal that total of $10,843. So there is equation 1 and 2, and there was one last sentence that used a bunch of numbers that we will need, and that is she invests 3 times as much in the growth fund as in the other two combined. So if she takes X plus Y, which is the CDs and the bonds, and they're telling us that we're going to have to multiply that by 3 in order to get Z, in order to get that growth fund, because it says 3 times as much as the other two combined. Now that will give us 3x plus 3y equals Z, but we need everything over on one side. So 3x plus 3y minus Z equals 0 is what we would put in our system. And I don't believe there are any directions here about what you had to use to solve this. So that was totally up to you. I mean, if you wanted to solve this using algebra, you sure could. I did not. I used my coefficient matrix. I'm going to have to spread this out with those decimals on there. And I said, you know what? I know I'd have to multiply this by x, y, z in order to get our matrix of 80,000, 10,843, and 0. And I used inverse matrices on my calculator. So this was A, and this was X, and this was B. And I used A inverse times B to get the answer. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video and punch this in and then show you on the Smartboard calculator how this worked out. You can see I went ahead and put in matrix A, 1, 1, 1, and then our percentages, 0.067, 0.093, 0.156, and then 3, 3, negative 1. I also put in my matrix with the right side of the equations, and that is in under matrix B. So a 3 by 1, and those are the numbers that we had for the totals. So now, back on the main screen, you're typing in A, the inverse of that, times B, and I can punch that in again while you're watching here. There's 1, inverse, and matrix B, which is number 2, enter. And there are the 3 solutions. So we just have to get those on here. So our matrix A inverse times B gave us this. And we go back to, you know, what did we use for X, what did we use for Y, and what did we use for Z? So X was, all the way back up at the top, CDs, bonds, and then we had that growth fund. So invest $14,500 in CDs, $5,500 in bonds, and $60,000 in the growth fund. And well, I guess we should say they invested. This is actually after the fact, so they invested $14,500 in CDs, $5,500 in bonds, and $60,000 in the growth fund. On to number 78. 78, we have Simpson's Drugstore needs to prepare a 40-liter mixture that is 32% acid from 3 solutions, a 10% acid solution, a 25% acid solution, and a 50% acid solution. How much of each solution should be used if Simpson's wants to use as little of the 50% solution as possible? So this one, it's not a perfect situation about the mixtures like we had in class, but we can see here that, 40 liters is the total, so x plus y plus z equals 40, and we can have x equal the 10% acid. I'm just going to put acid solutions here. Y would be the 25% acid solutions, and then Z would be the 50% acid solutions. So we also know from the one that we did in class that we have to talk about all of those concentrations. So we'll have 0.10x plus 0.25y plus 0.50z equals, and then we need to know what 32% of 40 is. And that comes out to 12.8. But unfortunately, we don't get that third equation, and the third equation is the one that allows us to, absolutely find everything the way that we would want to find it. So what we have to do is the same thing that we did with the earlier problem where things did not work out nicely. I think that was number 60. We do what we can and see what we have. All right, so the first thing I did here when I put this into the matrix was I multiplied everything in the second row by 100. So this is actually row 2 times 100. Let me put 100 row 2 out in front if I can fit it. And that's so that you're not dealing with any decimals. And then I just went ahead and made my reduced echelon form myself by multiplying -10 times row 1 and adding that to row 2. So row 1 stayed exactly as it was, but row 2 becomes -10 plus 10 is 0, -10 plus 25 is 15, -10 times 1 is -10, plus 50 is 40, -10 times 40 is -400, and that would give us 880. And then I thought, okay, I still would like to at least get a 1 in this position. Well, to do that, I'm going to leave that top row exactly the same. I'm not going to do anything weird with it. But with the bottom row, I really have to divide everything by 15. So I'm going to need to take 1/15 of row 2. So that'll give me 0, 1, 2 2/3, which is 8/3, and 58 2/3, which is 176/3. Now, why go to all that trouble? Because what we have to do is, again, look at this and say, okay, what do we know here? I mean, the top one tells me x plus y plus z equals 40. The bottom one tells me x is gone, y plus 8/3 z equals 176/3. Now, here's where things get interesting. Pretty obviously, we would really like to use all 3 of these in our concentration. So if that happens, that means that x should be greater than or equal to 0. I mean, it absolutely should be greater than or equal to 0. So we start thinking, okay, well, what does that mean to us? Well, let's go back and figure it out. You know, if x is greater than or equal to 0, what does that do to the equations that we have here? So, first thing to look at would be to say, all right, I know that y plus 8/3 z equals 176 thirds. So y will be equal to negative 8/3 z plus 176 thirds. So got that all done. And that's what's going to find me my 25% solution, because that's going to be y and how we find that information. So now I think, all right, well, I need to get this down to where I'm talking about something with x here, because I know I'm supposed to use something with x. So I'm going to go ahead and substitute y into my blue equation up here, and that will give me x minus 8/3 z plus 176 thirds plus z equals 40. And we would go ahead and combine like terms and get x by itself. So we'll have negative 8/3 z plus 1z, so that's negative 5/3 z. If I add that to both sides, I'll have 5/3 z on the right-hand side. And then we have that 176 thirds. Well, we go ahead and subtract that from both sides. And that would give us a negative 56 thirds. So now, start thinking about what's going to happen if x is greater than or equal to 0. So, if this has to be greater than or equal to 0, 5/3 z minus 56 thirds has to be greater than or equal to 0, because really we're substituting that in for x. So we'd add 56 thirds to both sides, and then we'd multiply by the reciprocal, 3/5. So z is greater than or equal to 56 divided by 5, which is 11.2. And that's actually what it is when x is 0. Now, if we use any more of that 10% solution, which is below the concentration of what we want, we're not going to be able to get anything that has fewer milliliters, or in this case liters, of z, which was our 50% solution, because that 10% is just going to keep watering it down. So it turns out we can't use any of the x in order for this to work. And in order to use the smallest amount possible of z, we're going to have to use 11.2. So now we can go back and figure out what y is by putting our z value back here. And y will equal negative 8/3 times 11.2 plus 176 thirds. And that turns out to be that our y is going to give us 28.8. And that's the best we can do. That's putting in absolutely none of that 10% solution, which would actually make it weaker, not stronger. So that's where we would have to produce. And that means we would have 0 liters of 10% acid, 28.8 liters of, that one was the 25% acid, and then we had 11.2 liters of the 50% acid. So again, not a perfect match for what we were doing in class, but probably very helpful in chemistry to be able to do that. All right, then number 79. Matthew has 74 coins, that's a total I want to keep track of, consisting of nickels, dimes, and quarters. All right, so we'll have nickels actually the number of nickels, so I should probably put just number of nickels. And Y will be the number of dimes. And Z will be the number of quarters. And we know that they total 74. So first off, X plus Y plus Z has to equal 74, unless they tell me somewhere in here, you know, that there's a different mix to this. And then we know the total value of the coins is $8.85. Well, there's another total. And this one's about money, and we know how much money each one of those is worth. So we need to write this in decimal form, or things are not going to work out well for us here, because all of our right sides of this equation are in dollars and cents. So we have to stay with dollars and cents as we write our equations. Unless we want to change the dollars and cents into pennies, you know, but smaller numbers are probably good here. And then it says if the number of nickels and quarters is 4 times more than the number of dimes. Okay, so let's see here. Nickels and quarters is 4 times the number of dimes. So X plus Z equals 4 times, 4 more than, not 4 times, 4 more than the number of dimes. Find how many of each coin Matthew has in his coin box. So let's go ahead and get our X and Y and Z on the same side and make sure they get in the right order. So X minus Y plus Z equals 4. There is our matrix. It's just hidden with all of those variables. So we're going to go ahead and pull the variables out. All right, there it is. And I'm guessing most of you would really like to do the reduced row echelon form in your calculator at this point. So I'm going to stop the video and punch that in. Now you can see that I went ahead and put that matrix into the calculator under matrix A. And like I said, I think most of you are most comfortable with just using the RREF on the calculator. So underneath math, alpha B, and we want that for second matrix, number 1. And there we see for the X's, 22, for the Y's, 35, for the Z's, 17. And we had those in order, so it's nickels, dimes, and quarters. So there it is, and we just need to put this in words so people understand what on earth we just found. So 22 nickels, 35 dimes, and 17 quarters. And those were all your questions.